Lucy Bennett had not eaten in 4 days. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to press them against her ribs just to keep them still. Through the glass of an upscale restaurant, she watched a woman in a cream-colored coat cut into a piece of salmon she would never finish. Lucy did not think about pride anymore. Pride does not keep you warm. Pride does not stop the ringing in your ears when your body runs on nothing. She pushed the door open, and the warm air hit her like a memory of a life she used to have. She walked up to the woman's table and said the only thing she had left to say. "Ma'am, if you're not going to finish your meal, may I have the leftovers?" The woman's fork stopped in midair. Her face went pale, as if she had seen someone who had been gone for 26 years. Nobody in that restaurant knew it yet, but in 48 hours, a single DNA test would tear open a secret that had been buried for over 2 decades, and somebody with more money and more power than anyone in that room would do absolutely anything to keep it buried. Before we go deeper into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Margaret Whitfield was not the kind of woman who noticed strangers. She had built a shipping empire from her father's single warehouse, and in the process she had learned to keep her eyes forward and her heart guarded. But something about this particular young woman broke through 30 years of careful distance. It was not her ragged coat or her cracked lips. It was her eyes. Margaret had only seen that exact shade of gray-green once before. On a hospital bassinet tag 26 years ago, on a baby she was told had died before she ever got to hold her. Margaret set her fork down slowly. She looked at the maitre d', who was already moving toward Lucy with the practice smile restaurants use right before they ask someone to leave. Margaret raised her hand. "Bring her a chair," she said. The words were quiet, but they carried across the whole dining room. A man at the next table, the kind who wears his watch like a personality, muttered just loud enough to be heard. "This is a restaurant, not a shelter." Margaret answered without raising her voice, which somehow made it worse for him. "If you have a problem with who I invite to my table, the door works both ways." He did not speak again. For Lucy, sitting down in that chair felt almost unbearable. Her whole life, she had told herself the same quiet story, the one she never said out loud. She had been left behind at that orphanage as a baby, and if her own mother had not wanted her, then nobody ever really would. It was easier to believe that than to keep hoping. So, even as the warm food sat in front of her, some old, guarded part of her kept waiting for the moment this kindness would disappear too, the way everything else always had. A server brought soup, warm bread, then a full plate of food. Lucy ate slowly, the way people eat when their stomach has forgotten what to do with real meals. Margaret watched her without seeming to watch her, and that was when she saw it. A small birthmark, shaped almost like a comma, just behind Lucy's left ear. Margaret's chest tightened. She had touched that exact mark once, 26 years ago, on a daughter she was told had not survived the night she was born. She said nothing yet. She needed to be sure. What Margaret did not know that night was that she was not the only one watching Lucy. A man in a gray sedan had been parked across the street since before Lucy ever walked through that door, and he was not there for the food. He worked for a man named Gerald Cole, her late husband's business partner, the man who had quietly managed the family's private affairs for over 2 decades. Gerald had learned within hours that Margaret Whitfield had invited a homeless stranger to sit at her table, and men like Gerald did not believe in coincidences. Margaret found reasons to keep Lucy close. A spare room, a quiet job answering phones. She told herself she was simply being kind, but part of her already suspected the truth and was terrified to say it out loud. Gerald, meanwhile, was not a man who waited to see how things unfolded. He had spent 20 years making sure a certain birth record could never surface, and he intended to keep it that way. Within the first week, he had someone quietly pull the personnel file of the clinic where Margaret had given birth 26 years earlier, checking to see who from that staff might still be alive to talk. He also placed a call to a woman he had not spoken to in over 2 decades, a retired nurse named Carol Ann Higgins, now living quietly 2 hours outside the city. He did not raise his voice. He never needed to. "I hear Margaret Whitfield has taken an interest in a young woman," he said. "I trust you remember our arrangement." When Carol Ann's voice trembled and she asked what would happen if the truth ever came out anyway, Gerald answered with a line he had clearly used before. "On other people, in other rooms, people don't remember the truth. he said. They remember the story they're told. And a lie repeated for 26 years stops being a lie. It becomes history. Carol Ann did not sleep that night. Before the investigation deepened, there was a quieter evening, one Margaret would return to in her memory many times afterward. Lucy insisted on cooking dinner one night, using nothing but what she found in Margaret's kitchen. The same resourcefulness that had kept her alive on the street now turned towards something gentler. She made a simple pasta dish, nothing fancy, but she set the table herself and lit 2 candles she found in a drawer. Margaret sat across from her, watching this young woman who owned almost nothing insist on giving something back anyway. Later that same week, Margaret watched from a doorway as Lucy knelt beside a frightened little girl outside a grocery store, a child who had gotten separated from her mother in the parking lot. Lucy did not panic or hover. She simply sat down on the curb beside her, spoke softly, and stayed until security found the mother. For the first time and longer than she could remember, Lucy let herself believe, just a little, that maybe she was not someone people left behind after all. Maybe this was what it felt like to actually belong somewhere. She was careful not to hope too loudly, but the hope was there, quiet and stubborn, growing anyway. Over the following days, Lucy's story came out in fragments. She had grown up in a state-run children's home outside Columbus, Ohio. She earned a scholarship to a state university and kept the acceptance letter folded in her wallet, even after the paper had gone soft. She fell in love during her second year with a man named Daniel, who disappeared with money she had been saving for tuition. A predatory loan she had co-signed for a roommate turned into a debt collector calling her workplace until she lost the job. Within 18 months, she had gone from a college sophomore with a bright future to a woman sleeping in a bus station. She told Margaret all of this without crying, because she said crying never fixed anything, it just wasted water. But there was one thing Lucy never mentioned. Tucked into the lining of her bag was a small brass key, worn smooth from years of handling, one she had carried since she left the orphanage and refused to ever throw away. Even when she had to leave nearly everything else behind, she never explained what it opened. Margaret noticed it once and chose not to ask, though she filed the question away in the back of her mind, certain it mattered more than Lucy was letting on. Margaret hired a private investigator, quietly, using a name that would not trace back to her company. She asked him to pull hospital records from the private maternity clinic she had used 26 years earlier. When he arrived at the county archive to request them, he was told the physical files from that exact month had been damaged in a flood years ago, an explanation that might have satisfied anyone who had not noticed the archive itself sat on the 3rd floor and had never once flooded. Someone had gotten there first. Undeterred, the investigator traced the maternity nurse who had signed the original paperwork, Carol Ann Higgins. When he finally reached her by phone, she sounded frightened before he had even explained why he was calling, and she hung up after less than a minute, telling him only, "I can't talk about this. Please don't call again." That fear told him more than any document could have. Someone had gotten to her first, and whoever it was still had enough influence to make a woman who had kept a 26-year-old secret suddenly remember exactly why she had never spoken about it. Margaret received an envelope with no return address a few days later. Inside was a single typed line. "Some things are better left buried. Stop asking questions." She sat with it for a long time, unsettled but unwilling to stop now that she was this close. 2 nights after that warning arrived, the investigator called her at almost midnight, his voice tight with adrenaline. The private record storage facility where copies of the clinic's remaining archives were kept, the backup location nobody outside a small circle even knew existed, had caught fire less than an hour earlier. Firefighters managed to save most of the building, but the section holding decades of maternity records from that exact clinic had burned completely. It was too precise, too convenient, to be anything but deliberate. Margaret sat with the phone still in her hand long after the call ended, feeling for the first time that this was no longer simply about old paperwork. Someone was willing to destroy evidence, threaten a retired nurse, and now burn an entire building, all to keep one 26-year-old secret exactly where it was. If they were willing to go this far, she wondered, how far would they go once they realized how close she actually was? With the archive gone, the DNA test became the only path left to the truth, and Margaret arranged for the sample collection under the cover story of a standard background check. What she did not know was that Gerald had a contact inside the private lab as well, someone who had agreed, for a significant fee, to flag any test involving the Whitfield name and delay the results just long enough for Gerald to decide what to do next. The results came back 3 days later than they should have. When the envelope finally arrived, Margaret held it on her lap for almost 20 minutes before she could bring herself to open it. 99.99%. Lucy Bennett was her daughter. Margaret sat alone in her study and cried in a way she had not allowed herself to cry since her husband's funeral. She thought about the nurse's fear, the burned archive, the anonymous warning, and understood that someone had worked for 26 years to make sure this exact moment never happened. She did not tell Lucy right away. If you found out today that someone you loved and thought you had lost was alive this whole time, and that someone had burned down a building to keep you from ever knowing, what would you do first? We would genuinely like to know in the comments below. Gerald Cole understood that fire and fear had bought him time, not victory. Margaret's investigator was still digging, and Carol Ann's silence would not hold forever, so he built something more permanent. He fabricated evidence suggesting Lucy had a criminal history under a different name. He paid a man to falsely claim Lucy had stolen from him. He had old security footage doctored to place her somewhere she had never been. He forged a letter, supposedly from a past employer, describing her as dishonest and manipulative. Piece by piece, he built a false version of Lucy designed to destroy the one thing money could not buy him, Margaret's trust in her own daughter. The false evidence landed on Margaret's desk from 3 directions within the same week, and for a moment, doubt crept in where certainty used to be. She confronted Lucy with a coldness Lucy had not felt from her before. Standing in the doorway of the home she had just started to trust, Lucy felt that old familiar wound tear back open. Maybe this was simply how it always went. Maybe everyone eventually leaves, one way or another, and she had been foolish to let herself hope otherwise. She did not argue or plead. She simply said the sentence that would echo through the rest of this story. I didn't ask you for your fortune. I only asked for your leftovers. Then she walked out. Margaret stood frozen in the hallway long after the door closed. Something about the way Lucy said it did not sit right with her. Manipulative people beg, cry, and threaten. Lucy had done none of those things. She had left with the same quiet dignity she showed the night she first asked for a plate of food instead of demanding one. Margaret sat down and, for the first time since the accusations arrived, made herself actually examine the evidence instead of reacting to it. The cracks did not take long to find once someone was actually looking. Her investigator traced the falsified security footage to an editing contractor paid in cash from an account tied to Gerald Cole. He confirmed the flood story about the archive had been invented the same week Margaret first hired him, and that the fire matched the same pattern, evidence disappearing exactly when it became dangerous. When he returned to Carol Ann Higgins, this time with police protection arranged quietly through a contact Margaret trusted, the retired nurse finally broke down and told him everything, including who had called her that first night and what he had threatened to do if she ever spoke. Gerald believed he had won. With Lucy gone and Margaret's trust apparently shattered, he called a small gathering at the company's headquarters, using it as an opportunity to publicly and permanently discredit Lucy in front of the board, painting her as a con artist who had nearly deceived Margaret out of her fortune. He stood at the head of the table, confident, unaware that Margaret had arrived early and was waiting just outside the doors. Margaret walked in first, alone, and let Gerald finish most of his speech before she spoke. You're right. That someone in this story has been lying for 26 years, she said. It just isn't her. Then Carol Ann Higgins walked in behind her, followed by the investigator, who placed a folder on the table containing the falsified documents, the payment records, and a sworn statement. Gerald reached for the same calm certainty that had carried him for 20 years and said, almost to himself, people don't remember the truth. They remember the story they're told. Margaret answered quietly, not this time. His confidence drained slowly in front of the same employees who had spent years fearing him, as 2 police officers stepped through the door behind them and asked him to come with them. Margaret found Lucy 3 days later, working a temporary shift at a small diner outside the city, and this time it was Margaret who stood in the doorway asking permission to sit down. She told her everything about the hospital, the nurse, the fire, the 26 years of believing a lie because it was easier than the ugly truth. Lucy sat quietly through all of it, and when Margaret finished, She reached across the table and took her mother's hand for the first time in either of their memories. A week later, the two of them drove out to the children's home together, and Lucy finally used the small brass key she had carried for so many years to open a storage locker in the basement, the one place she had ever been allowed to keep something of her own. Inside was a child's crayon drawing of a house with too many windows, her scholarship acceptance letter folded soft from years of handling, a tiny knitted baby blanket she did not remember, but somehow still recognized by touch, and an old hospital identification bracelet with a birth date on it that matched Margaret's daughter exactly. Lucy sat on the floor of that basement and finally let herself cry, not from grief, but from the sudden, overwhelming understanding that she had never been unwanted at all. She had been stolen from someone who loved her before she had even opened her eyes, and had spent every day since wondering why she had been left behind, when the truth was that she never had been. Lucy did not choose a life of comfort just because comfort was suddenly available to her. She became a teacher at a public school, not far from the children's home where she grew up. Every Friday, she bought meals for anyone she found outside a certain diner who looked like they needed it, the same way a stranger once bought a meal for her. The first time Lucy ever walked into a restaurant, she was asking for leftovers because it was all she had left to ask for, and because some part of her still believed she deserved nothing more than what other people did not want. Years later, she walked into other restaurants carrying meals for people who had nothing, not out of guilt or obligation, but because she finally understood her own worth had never been measured by how she was treated. Life, in its own quiet way, had come full circle. Sometimes the meal we think we are giving away becomes the very thing that brings a family home. Kindness rarely announces itself as anything important in the moment, but it has a way of uncovering truths that even 26 years of silence, a burned archive, and one very powerful man could not keep buried forever. If you were in Margaret's position that night, would you have offered that chair? And if you were Lucy, would you have found the courage to ask? Let us know down in the comments. We read every single one of them. And if this story moved you even a little, make sure you are subscribed, because we have many more stories just like this one on the way.